If you don't mind, I'm going to switch my camera off so I get better.
No, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Out in the wilds of Windsor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so we get started then, I think. Morning, everyone. I'm just saying I've got the remnants of COVID, so if I suddenly cough my heart out, please excuse me. I'll try and switch the mic off. So welcome. We got any public questions, Julie?
No public questions and no apologies.
Okay, that's good. Could I just thank Naomi for standing in at very short notice at the last public board meeting. Thank you very much for that. Perhaps you should do all of them right then. Declarations of any other business? Declarations of interest? Minutes of the meeting of the 14th of February. Any corrections, please? The action log and matters arising. I think it's all sort of in hand or done, I think, unless someone's going to raise something. Okay. Item 6 under the quality section, patient story, community diabetes service. Debbie, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. And Alison, I can see you're here. Thank you ever so much for joining. And hopefully you're aware that Jan isn't joining because she's not well, but I think you were expecting Emma to be with you, weren't you?
Yes, but she had to go into she had to cover a consultant clinic this morning. So it
That's
is just
fine.
me. Yes.
That's absolutely fine. You're very, very welcome. And thank you ever so much for doing the story. So today's story is around community diabetes. It's got a little bit of service quality improvement in it and patient story. So hopefully everyone will find it really interesting. And Alison, I will hand over to you to introduce yourself and take us through it.
Okay, thank you. My name's Alison Jones. I'm the Diabetes Project Manager from the Diabetes Centre at King Edward Hospital. So I was part of this project. So let me just share my screen so we can go through this. Okay. Can everyone see that? Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine, thanks.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So part of the what we were looking at in terms of the diabetes improvement project was that we were an outlier for our HbA1c being less than 58 millipoles per mole. So if I can just show you this, this was a national diabetes audit 2019 to 2020, and Berkshire Healthcare, we had 30% of our patients that had an HbA1c less than 58, but the national average was 31.6%. So we were below the national average, which and it was significant. So part of our remit here was to look at why. So we used the project management tool that we use here, and we looked at the data. So our ultimate goal was that we wanted to improve to our HbA1c for our patients with type 1 diabetes by 3%. So that was our goal, that we wanted to hit the target of 33% of our patients with a target level HbA1c of less than 58 millimoles per mole. So initially, what we needed to do is identify who these patients were, because our patients were coded only as new and follow-up patients. They were mixed between type 1, type 2s and different, pancreatic cancer, those kinds of patients. So we needed to identify. So we went for a big bit of project work to change all our team codes so we can then identify our type 1 patients. So we recoded them all and then recoded them into technologies as well. So whether they were using insulin pumps or flash technology and other glucose monitoring systems. So what this actually allowed us to do was then we can focus our patients into set designated clinics. So the consultants, when we came, they either had a technology clinic with type 1s, they had and a pump clinic for our type 1 patients, or a general type 1 clinic. But whereas previously they had a mixture, and the mindset of managing type 2 people, type 2 diabetes and type 1 is actually different. So we thought it would be much more beneficial to actually have specialist clinics. So by looking at this data, we had designated clinics. We increased the length of their clinic appointments because looking through technology we're looking at lots of blood sugars now, whereas we used to just have a few blood sugars to look at. Now we have a huge amount of data to look at, so we increased that, made that we could focus our care more on our patients. We developed more education for our patients as well, virtual and flash glucose technology. So we provided a lot of education to the patients to help them self-manage. And we also became a member of the Type 1 Collaborative, looking at the diabetes outcomes nationally, which was a great help for us. We were able to write a business case, so we now have our own whole-time equivalent consultant here in the Diabetes Centre, which she helps move things forward and helps us focus on improving patient care. And now we're obviously working towards finding out all the missing type 1s that we have. So that's what changes we made. We now also worked with Rio to build a new diabetes assessment form. So now we can pull data for lots of time in range data for our flash glucose monitors. We can do demographics. We can look at social deprivation areas to make sure that we're meeting equity in our service, to make sure that we're not offering only technologies to those set cohort of patients. So we're able now to pull all of this information, which enables us to improve our patient care. So when we look from 2020 to 2021 NDA National Diabetes Audit, Berkshire Healthcare actually achieved a 36.5% patients with a HbA1c of less than 58. So that was a 6.5% increase, which was great. And the national average at that point was 34.8. But we continue to collect the information, the data, and we actually have 38% of our patients with type 1 diabetes having an HbA1c of less than 58 millimoles per mole, whereas previously it was 30. So we're far by making a huge achievement with this. So what does that mean for the actual patient? Well, what that means is, this is the one patient of ours, 18 years old, type 1 diabetes, diagnosed in 2010. HbA1c was 62 millimoles per mole. They're on just a basal bolus insulin injection regimen. So they saw the consultant, saw the specialist dietitians. We at that time considered flash technology, which is where you scan your blood sugars on your arm. So we had a trial of that for 14 days. They attended the education, they completed all the paperwork for food diary completion, the patient was considering going on our carbohydrate counting course. We reviewed their data, we educated them on a one-to-one carbohydrate counting education, and that they were keen to go on the group education, so we managed to get them on too. And what happened with the flash glucose technology and the support from learning how to carbohydrate count, the patient was able to meet a target level of 83% of their blood sugars being in range, 14% high, one very high and 2 low, which was a great achievement because in December 2022, their HbA1c had dropped by 10 millimoles per mole to 52 millimoles per mole, which was a great achievement for that patient. So all through education and the flash glucose technology enabled them to improve their health outcomes. Then the next, regarding technologies, we use insulin pump therapy. So this patient was 40, type 1 diabetes, diagnosis in 1995. They're also on a basal bolus insulin regimen, but their HbA1c was 70 millimoles per mole. They were using glucose technology, but they had something called the dawn phenomenon, which meant the blood sugars would go up. At the beginning, just before they woke up. So it's really difficult to manage that by insulin injection. And they were just getting extremely frustrated with their control because the patient wanted to improve, but they just felt that they didn't have the ability to change anything. They weren't accurately carbohydrate counting either, so we managed to book them onto our carbohydrate counting education program. We considered them to be on something called a continuous glucose monitor and put them on an insulin pump, which helps them program the amount of insulin they give every hour. So they had support through education, and then this together with the continuous glucose monitor, the pump was put in for something called a closed loop system, which means that the continuous glucose monitor is monitoring the blood sugars, but also then was able to tell the insulin pump to increase or decrease so the amount of insulin given. So 2 weeks after they started on this technology, they were in 76% target range, which was great, whereas they only able to achieve 60% on the basal bolus insulin measurement. And then moving on from a year later, they were now 82% time in range, and they've reduced their HbA1c from 70 millimoles per mole to 46 millimoles per mole, so a decrease of 24 millimoles per mole. So this patient is extremely happy. Their blood sugars are very well controlled, and they don't have this spike of a high blood sugar causing all the damage that high blood sugars cause. Working with the National Diabetes Collaborative feedback, we work closely with them for our type 1, and now we're actually part of the collaborative for the insulin pump therapy. And this is just an email, I'm not expecting you to read the whole thing, but Michael Sykes is the lead. And he actually has asked us as Berkshire Healthcare to provide support for all of those that are part of the group, because obviously the amount of work that we've put in to collect our information and our data and to improve our patient care, a lot of other diabetes services around the nationally are asking for our help now. So that's lovely to know that all of our good input that we've had is has actually paid off for our patients and also for Berkshire. And that's it. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks very much. Perhaps I could just start. Can you unshare your screen, do you think, please?
Yes, of course. Yep.
Oh, we've got lots of questions, so I'll let my colleagues come in first. Mark.
Yeah, Alison, thanks ever so much for a really encouraging and positive presentation. It was great to hear. I know that nationally it's often been more difficult for engagement with young people with diabetes rather than older people. Do you find that you've had as much success with those younger people wanting to engage with your initiatives, or has that been tougher?
I think since the technologies have come on board, I think they're finding it, they are engaging with us better actually, because that we can encourage them to remote monitor, so we can actually review blood sugars remotely for them to help improve their care. And also we now have a designated under 25 clinic as well, so we are able to try and focus specifically on that group of patients. Yeah,
That's great. Thank you.
Mahmouda.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Alison. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering about type 2 diabetes and prevention and managing sort of preconditions, if that's possible, and whether you have any involvement and whether there's been any success in any program that you've instituted.
Well, the patients that are newly diagnosed don't tend to come to the diabetes centre. However, we are involved in the patient education programs for newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So we do run group education for these patients, which is part of our DEAL education program, and we are there also to support the practices. So not only with the education, but to help with the titration of medications or have any questions that the patients may have, or should I say the healthcare professionals may have. We have a healthcare professional line for them to call in to us for any advice that they might require.
Okay, but do you have any involvement with sort of prevention rather than newly diagnosed? No.
We don't. No, we don't. No. I know that there's the National Diabetes Prevention Programme that people can go on, but we don't have any involvement in that. No.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Sally.
Alison, it's great to see the improvement your service has made around the HbA1cs, because I recall when the national audit came to the quality committee, we were a bit of an outlier. Yeah. And if I recall correctly, one of the issues that we talked about at that committee was the expertise of the nursing team in terms of providing support around people who had insulin pumps, because obviously that's where you get the best control
Yeah.
And I just wondered a bit where we were now in terms of a critical mass of people who can provide that support, and also what we provide, because if people are on pumps, they've got to have phone access, haven't they, sometimes?
Yes.
Whether we provide that sort of on-call support, you know, and how's it going?
Yeah, so actually we've got a team now where we've got 2 designated diabetes specialist nurses and 2 designated diabetes specialist dietitians who run the insulin pump service. And we are upskilling all of the staff here at the Diabetes Centre to manage insulin pump therapy. They might not be experts, but they know how to deal with the certain issues that patients might ring up with. So we're definitely training everyone here. In terms of, yes, it's remote monitoring, which makes life a lot easier for people with insulin pump therapy. So if any patient has an issue or healthcare professional has an issue, we can easily just log in to our so-called accounts and see everyone's blood sugars and settings and aspects like that. So it definitely is a help to be able to monitor like that. Yes, yeah. So we do have the skills.
And I can phone you if I'm worried. You know, if I've got I can phone you. What happens there?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
Right.
Yeah, we're always accessible. If you're on insulin pump under our service, the patient is free to phone or email us. Yes, at any point. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Alison. It's always good to see, you know, when we focus and put the right amount of effort in, we can turn a service around from being a sort of laggard to a leader. I'm kind of struck by the precipitate for this. So your presentation started with benchmarking and how the benchmarking showed us that we were behind, and so we needed to take action. So I'm a bit inquisitive about that. I'm a bit curious about, if that benchmarking data had not been available, what might it have been that caused us to sort of say, you know what, this is a service that needs improvement and it could be improved. Because I want to believe, I don't have any insight into diabetes at all, sadly, but I want to believe that diabetes patients have a lot of data, knowledge and information at their availability because they're interested in it and they can find it on the internet and so on. And so, you know, I'm supposing that lots of patients would be lobbying us and giving us their opinions about what could and should be happening. So any thoughts about that? Were we seeing that before we took action?
I mean, I think we were. I think the difficulty is that we couldn't identify the patients that needed more support initially. I think that's why getting the data was important, because you're right, the patients see their blood sugars all the time, so it's more the case of how we then engage with that. But then I think the difficulty with diabetes, it's a long-term condition, and people sometimes just monitoring their blood sugars just to keep them day to day don't always focus on improving their blood sugar control in a long-term way. I mean, they firefight, they look at their blood sugar now, they sort it out now. So I think from our point of view as a service, we were looking at more the HbA1c, which just measures the long-term prevention of the long-term complication, and it's us to identify those patients and then bring them in and give them extra support. So because on a one-to-one basis, it's quite tricky to keep on top of that, and because the patient's focus sometimes is very different. So I think you're right, they do have the technology to help themselves. I think then it was for us to identify those patients and contact them to be more proactive to help them further. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Julian.
Thanks, Martin. Just very quickly, thanks, Alison. It was a really good presentation. And it's more a comment really, which was to say that in the sort of quality committee, board committee, we've seen sort of audits in previous years, you know, our performance, which hasn't been particularly good. And I just suppose it's a good demonstration actually about the practical application of clinical audit and how it can help us improve, because sometimes they can feel a bit abstract, you know, the audits, and sometimes they count some quite abstract things. And I think this is a good example of where a national clinical audit has really helped us kind of improve in a very tangible and practical way, and really grateful that the team have sort of taken time to sort of get under the skin of it, really. But yeah, just demonstrates the power of audit actually very helpfully.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Julian. Alison, I think time's against us, but I just got one question of my own, which is about, at the beginning, you talked about separating the different categories of patients into the type of diabetes or age and this sort of stuff. And I know nothing about this, so forgive me if I'm saying silly things. But I seem to recall that the Asian population in Slough is particularly high prevalence of diabetes. And I'm just wondering, in terms of your separation to different categories, you've seen a difference in the Asian population, particularly in Slough, compared to your other categories of views of patients. You know, is there some particular problems? Does it all come up to something which we all think now is roughly the same for every category of patient, or?
No, you're absolutely right. So there is more prevalence of having Asian for Asian descent to have type 2 diabetes. So we have looked at this actually to see whether, because it is type 1 diabetes is more of a Caucasian condition, but we have looked at equity across the board in the fact that we are treating everyone equally, because we've looked at the total cohort of type 2, type 1 population. However, saying that, by categorizing, we have categorized type 2, which allows us then to focus more on their medications and their outcomes, because we're not in a clinic anymore with a mixture of a type 1 patient and a type 2. We actually now focus more on the fact that we have designated type 2 clinics. So from that cohort of patients, yes, we can then focus more on their medication, their cardiovascular issues, their, you know, all of the other medications. So it actually helped us from both angles. So yes, even though someone from an Asian descent has more type 2, we are helping them now. And to be honest, we're collecting a lot of information for that to make sure that we're providing them now a service. So we've moved on from type 1 and we're now focusing on our efforts on our type 2 population. Yes.
So just to close this, in terms of the different categories of patients, whether it's Asian or whatever, you sort of feel that forgive me, I've got a bit of a cough, that the ability to treat and to look after those different categories is sort of equitable across the patch. You haven't got one particular category that you're really worried about, you can't reach, or you can't.
No, and we've managed to be able to collate and pull all that data now. Now we've got the ability to do that. We can look at it all. So yes, no, we're really happy that we're providing an equitable service. Yeah.
Very good. In which case, Alison, add my thanks to everyone else's really interesting presentation, really important work, and thank you very much. Good luck.
Thank you.
We'll let you go. Thank you very much. Well, that's very good, very interesting. Thanks, Debbie, for bringing that to the board. Perhaps we can move on then to Quality Assurance Committee. Sally, minutes of the meeting, and then the learning from deaths and the guardians of safe working. I don't know with Sally whether you're going to speak to all three or whether we're going to invite Minu to speak to the last two. Over to you anyway.
If I speak to the minutes of the meeting, and obviously an important issue there is the quality concerns report, which I think is a really good example of good practice. And there've been ongoing concerns which we've discussed as a board around the community mental health teams. And as you can see, 3 of the risks have been brought together there. And we've talked about these, the entry into our mental health services and the issue of simplifying pathways, interfaces, which are really important because that's often where, an area of risk when patients go from one service to another, and a shared understanding of risk assessment across the services. And there's also there, which I think is quite important, which is around delayed and missed appointments in the community nursing service. And that really is around demand and capacity issues. And it's important because as from our last meeting, more and more services are going into the community. And if I'm right in thinking, but one of the executives might want to come in here, I think the executive team have commissioned a review of community nursing. In terms of serious instances, same sort of numbers as before. No preventing future death reports from inquests. And I think another example of good practice is actually the employment of this family liaison officer, who it was suggested we might invite to a future meeting. Ongoing updates on the National Patient Safety Strategy, which needs to be implemented by September 23, but that seems to be going well. Really important item there on patient safety culture work, and this importance of not only systems but culture, and the need never to be complacent, particularly where you've got closed environments. It is a concern that the incidence of sexual safety in terms of patients on nurses is increasing. I think that's amplified nationally, and it may be that people are becoming more aware and more inclined to report, but that is a concern. And the other issue that I'd raise there is the government's rapid review of mental health inpatient services. And this is in response to some of the national high profile alleged failures in mental health services. People will recall the Panorama programme last September, and then more recently there's been the Mid-Essex issues. And it's really around at national level how patient safety concerns can be more effectively identified from data. And the team that's actually reviewing did come to the trust and interviewed, I know, leadership team, and they also interviewed me in terms of the sort of data that we receive around mental health services and how helpful we find that and how we can identify any issues. But I'm very, very happy to take any questions from the meeting, particularly if my colleagues who also attended the meeting wanted to contribute in any way.
Thanks so much, Sally. Any comments from colleagues? Very clear. In which case, Minu, do I turn to you just for the next two items under this heading?
That would be good. Thank you, Martin. Good morning, everyone. So the Learning from Deaths report, the Q3 report that is ending in December of 22, it's a fairly standard report in the sense we don't see anything which is out of the ordinary. Our total sort of data on deaths that we collect, the number that we go through at first stage and then second stage review, and there are no deaths that we have recorded during the review that period, that quarter, that we felt were more than 50% likely to be due to problems in care, which is all good, and I'm happy to take any questions on that. I think more importantly, within our group and a mortality review group, and my executive colleague Debbie, of course, Dan, as the Deputy Director of Nursing, who runs the patient safety team, we are in sort of discussions about where next. So it's good not to have any deaths due to greater than 50% likelihood, or, the term lapse in care, well, we know a lot of people don't like using that term, but, we don't want just problems in care. But we want to refine it even further and see a level of avoidability of deaths. And I think from April, we are starting to collect that data of an avoidability score, which the acutes regularly do. It's not been very clear in the guidance for mental health and community, but we're going to apply that to our deaths also. So it's a 1 to 6 Likert scale in which we look at it. Of course, a score of 3 is the lapse in care score and such. So we're going to refine it even further. We're going to have discussions in the new PSERV system, how we bring together the themes from SI deaths, which are a small number, and then the larger number of non-SI deaths, because they roughly will have similar themes in mental health and physical health, and how we bring that together and use one set of learning. So all that is work that we intend to do in the next year or two as the new PSERV system gets implemented. So happy to take any questions on this report or anything to do with mortality from colleagues.
Minu, could I can I just ask, this is clearly a very thorough process and, well-rehearsed process. I suppose the question which may be just answered by the medical examiner issue is, how do we ensure that our judgment about the 50% judgment is sound, and we aren't all sort of getting into some sort of group think and getting hooked. How do we get that independent view that our judgment, or sorry, your judgment and your colleagues' judgment is sound? I'm not implying it's not in any way, but just you know,
Yeah,
how do you quality check the assessment?
It's a fair question, Martin. I think from where we manage this process, we have several sort of layers of checking and then looking at it again. So the scoring is first done at the level of the individual who does the SGR and completes it, which is often a clinician, someone from the service, and they give that score. That's then reviewed by the clinical director, who then either has to agree or disagree with that score and decide. And then it finally does come to the Trust Mortality Review group, and it's not just the group. Sort of Debbie and I, you know, of course, I go through it line by line and will raise questions sometimes before the meeting, in the meeting, before we absolutely agree that if there was any suspicion of lapse in care or significant avoidability, that we have explored every avenue there. Now, that is our internal process of sort of several layers, but also if there are any concerns from the medical examiner, which we've not had so far in issues, they would raise it with us and say, well, you know, this is an area where we think we have a concern about the lapse in care. And then, of course, there's finally the coronial system, you know, which is for some of our absolute SI, that's only a small proportion go through that. And that is a check on a wider, so do we have a lot of comeback from the coroner that we need prevention of future deaths type of actions, and we don't. So we have several internal processes and external checks. I don't think there is anyone who actually asks someone externally to come and review all their debts, because that would be a bit over the top, as long as we are confident that we have our internal processes, which is more than one level. And then we have external scrutiny, which has not raised a concern to us as yet, at least.
That's fine, Minu. Thank you very much. Any other questions on this? No? Can we move on to Guardians of Safe Working then, Minu?
Thank you, Shaw. There's not much to say there. We really have just one exception report of time to spend, you know, to complete a piece of work by a doctor. I mean, you really couldn't get less than that. I mean, of course, 0 is less than 1, but we are at that level. You know, it goes into hundreds in acute trust, and I have to say, against you know, earlier comments that we are a mental health trust, hence we don't have it. No, that's not true. There are mental health trusts with scores of exception reports also, and we don't have that. So, you know, our satisfaction level is reflected, is very high for junior doctors, and, you know, we have to say no to junior doctor placements here rather than having, you know, huge number of gaps, which we had in the past. So that is a summary of how we manage this process, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to Sally. If everyone's happy, we'll move on to executive report. Oh, Julian's got your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, just a late one, but just obviously, given it's the first day of the junior doctors strike,
Yeah.
I just thought, in the interest of transparency, it might be just helpful for. I know that Minu's already sent a note around, but obviously we haven't done that in public. It'd just be useful probably for Minu just to give us a take on the junior doctor strike, and particularly the impacts and the mitigations we've got in place at the moment. That'd be possible.
Thank you. That would be absolutely fine if that's okay with the rest of the board. So yes, I'm at Prospect Park Hospital at the moment. We've been around the wards where we thought there might be some pressure. And we have to remember, it's not just the lack of junior doctors which causes the pressure. This is holiday time, so in the best of circumstances, we would have had just about enough staff, you know, to safely manage services. And then you had dropouts from junior doctors who are striking today. We've been taking measures for several months now. Of course, for the first round of strikes, we've repeated those for the second round. The planning has been, you know, to our satisfaction. In terms of any impact on our non-mental health services, I haven't heard of any impact. We have exceptionally small number of junior doctors, maybe 1 or 2 in a couple of services. So there we don't have an impact. For our mental health services, it's either it's inpatient or non-inpatient services. All other services outside the inpatient areas are fully staffed. There is no concern there. It is the inpatient, where Prospect Park Hospital, where I am just now, where we've had to take additional measures of having physical health nursing colleagues. In fact, that is why I think the diabetes presentation was not done by a colleague who's actually here to help out, you know, with some of the work which can be done by nursing colleagues for us. We had pharmacy additional support, the Mental Health Act office, and we've had additional cover place. So going around, everyone seems satisfied. There isn't an immediate concern, also forget a risk level, but we'll have to monitor this shift by shift over the next 4 days.
Really, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for your efforts in getting it all under control. Okay, can we move on to item 7 then? Executive report, questions as usual for Julian. Anything? I was just interested in the commentary, Julian, on the public attitudes survey to the NHS, which doesn't make very pleasant reading, but I suppose it's not surprising considering the world we're in. But the one response I did think was quite interesting is the one about where should more money come from for the NHS, and the top response was not to give any more money, but to make it work more efficiently, or words to that effect. So I think there's quite a hill to climb on rebuilding our confidence of our public and communities. I know we're doing, you know, a great job in this trust, but as a whole, it's going to be quite tough, I think, the next few years. Scott, I don't expect that politicians of whatever colour are going to be throwing lots of money at us in the short term. So.
Yeah, I think that's right, Martin. I knew you were going to pick that sort of comment out as well, because it is sort of quite intriguing, isn't it? Amongst overwhelming support for the NHS, despite the frustrations, there is that sort of comment, and I think it is also the issue that politicians of all colours and those leading the NHS nationally are concerned about, and that's productivity. So yeah, the workforce growth versus the productivity sort of conundrum is something I think we've talked about as well at this board, and something that, you know, I guess that we need to make sure that we've got our own house in order in terms of that, so that people can see that for the additional investment in mental health through the mental health investment standard, or in terms of the new community services like virtual wards or whatever, that there is increased activity associated with those initiatives. And it's something that during the course of this year, we will need to monitor closely and report on. That will include things like, Martin, which we previously talked about, you know, addressing those sort of big services, you know, the 5 with the biggest, longest waits and things like that, and seeing an improvement in productivity there. So I think you're right. I think it's in tune with sort of what we've got planned.
Yeah, I just wonder whether we ought to think about doing a bit more publicity about what, you know, the improvements we are making. So I know that they're making it. Obviously, the patient groups that are affected see the benefits of it, but something, not sort of showing off about it, but just a bit more information. So that, because we want to maintain a positive view of the world. We are making progress. We are doing a good job, and I think we just need to, without getting you know, too fancy about it, just be able to explain what we are doing, how improvements are happening, and there's a steady way forwards. And Aileen.
I was going to make kind of a similar point to your final point there, Martin. First of all, I wondered, it was a national sample, wasn't it, Julian? So presumably we haven't got any breakdown of, you know, any variances across the country from that. But, you know, my point was going to be exactly what Martin said. Could we actually go out with some, I mean, we do some great social media. I wondered if there's more we could do in that space to pick up on the point Martin made, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, if we can. As I say, it's part of our work plan for next year, which is to sort of get under the skin of our productivity and also highlight those, because we have got some services, as you know, that are still really struggling, and productivity we're struggling with too. But I agree. There is also, say, for example, if we take community dental as a good example, where their waits are now less than they were pre-pandemic. because they've kind of it is actually a good message, and sort of, it's not all doom and gloom. We have been able to make some improvements, so we'll certainly look at that. It may take a little while to sort of get that, but I do think it's a really good point to highlight those ones.
Thank you. Naomi.
Thank you, Martin. So Julian, sticking with the same topic, this looks like a body of data and information that is, ostensibly at least invaluable. And I'm just interested in where it goes and who looks at it and the sort of so what, because at one level it could be just simply all delegate, here's the data and information, send it to providers and they have to kind of go and act. But I'd love to believe that it's a bit more forensic than that, and there's a sort of a body or a dedicated agent who's looking at it and being a bit more prescriptive about how we take this data information and actually apply something a bit more systematic. Am I dreaming?
No, I don't think so. I mean, the first group of people, in terms of influential folk, are politicians. I mean, this is sort of gold dust, isn't it? Because it tells you the things that you probably ought not to touch and tinker with, and it tells you things where they might be on safer ground to do that. And so I think I probably sort of gave at least one indication of where the centre is at. NHS England is on that productivity piece, because it chimes with the sort of public piece, whereas you'll see that the funding and the mechanisms of funding are kind of stay well alone from this. So I think politicians have got a view on it. NHS England will sort of take a view on it. Systems, and then ourselves as well, as per that conversation we just had, because obviously there's a lot of pressure. We're talking it today in the midst of a junior doctors strike. I guess we are a relatively stable organisation and in a position perhaps to take and extract some of the key messages from this and do something about it, I guess. So we may not have to wait for others. We can perhaps influence others, but also do a bit ourselves as well. But there will be definitely some policy directives based on this nationally, I would have thought, because it's like gold dust, isn't it?
It certainly is. Yeah, I mean, I'm always intrigued about how information gets used and then acted upon, but thank you for that. And if I may, just a second question, actually on the delegation, item 4 of your paper, which talks about the delegation of the 3 services, the POD to ICSs, and this is obviously a national initiative, so to speak. How does it impact us?
Well, directly, it doesn't, but indirectly, obviously, the patients who use those services are our patients, because they're often sort of taking up, other services. It's an additional responsibility for integrated care boards to get their head round, and they're not a year old. So if you take the paper I wrote sort of for the last board and talked about how ICBs are currently developing, this is quite a big ask for them. And I think I make the point. I can make the point around, say, for example, I pick out dentistry, don't I? Which is not the specialist bit that we do, but dentistry generally, which we all know is really struggling with. And we know from the survey that it's an area of particular dissatisfaction. They've just been landed with that. So if they're wanting to turn that around, that's going to exercise quite a lot of their senior time and attention, whilst they've got a lot of other things to do. So that was probably the point I'm making is that they're actually being given a lot to do, and there is the potential for indigestion, isn't there?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Sally.
All I wanted to say was actually with the NHS survey, it is the gold standard around statistical analysis. So it's got a lot of weight around validity and reliability. And I do agree with Julian in as much as I think it's got more political clout more than anything else, and it will be for politicians to largely take heed of this or respond to it in however they want to.
Okay, all right, thanks, Sally. I still think that there's a bit more we can do in showcasing some of the great work we are doing, except it's not about pretending we're better than we are. It's just about where we're making significant progress. We should be explaining to people just so they don't think the whole thing is falling apart, because it's not. You've only got to look at the French health system, which is in difficulties as well, to know it's not a local problem to the UK. Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that. Move on then, please. Gender pay. Jane, are you here? You are here, Jane.
I am here. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Gender pay gap.
Just before you start, Jane, can I just say, this is a paper, and it's not just on this board, it's a paper I see elsewhere. They're very difficult to interpret, I find, and anything you can do to help sort of bring out the key things would be really helpful. And I do note that you ask about getting some more an analyst, data analyst, to help really understand what it means. So I don't think it's just me, but the more you can simplify it, I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Martin. I had to, go to explain this paper. I have to go through it in some depth as well. Basically, the gender pay gap that we have is getting smaller, but we do still have a gender pay gap. And compared to our peers, we have a bigger gender pay gap than most in the region. The reality of it is that the gender pay gap is caused because we've got more senior staff who are male than, and that's what they are paid. So they're paid higher. The answer to that is that you can either put in more senior women into senior roles and pay them more, or you could get more men into junior roles. And the reason that we see a skew particularly is that we have a massively skewed population group, in that we have 80% of our staff are women. And actually all the growth in our workforce in the last couple of years between grades 2 and 4, which are our entry level roles, has been in women and not men. So that's Martin, you've always talked about this and about that we don't have enough men in more junior roles. And that is the reality of it. The organisation has the number of men in the organisations remained stable, and the number of women has increased. We always have to talk about the medical bonuses, the CEAs, the Clinical Excellence Awards, because they do drive disparity. Now, that's not Minu's fault. Minu's not doing anything wrong here. This is a nationally recognised scheme. The scheme has driven that division, and that is because senior medics are holding awards. Some of them are holding those awards for life, and we can't change them, and they were disproportionately in the past given to men rather than women. There is new awards. We have tried to do an equal distribution on awards. That means that if you are in post and you're a medic, we will give you an equal distribution of the Clinical Excellence Award pot. However, the pushback has come from the BMA, where they wanted those awards to be given out pro rata based on hours of work. And that, again, because we have more women who work part-time, including more female medics who work part-time, that again drives a difference. So basically, to understand it, we have a higher number of females skewed against a smaller number of higher paid males, and that is made worse by the fact that we have more women who choose to work part-time, and therefore their salaries look disproportionately lower than the male equivalents working in higher graded roles and primarily full-time. Does that help?
Well, I guess it sort of helps. I suppose the question that's in one's mind is what can we do about it?
Yep,
and you'll come on to that, I think, aren't you?
Absolutely. I knew you'd want to focus on the actions. There's two main way that we tackle this. One is about talent progression, particularly for women, and that's about expanding some of our talent programs and talent processes beyond what we do at exec level, deeper into the organisation, and there is a plan to do that this year. And the increasing attraction of men into entry-level roles. We are beginning to see more men coming into some of our areas like nursing. International recruitment is helping us to do that. But there is something that we can do to address that inequality in a number of areas, particularly allied health professionals. And we're looking to see if we can use apprenticeships as a way to change the diversity of people in some of our professions, which traditionally have been very female dominated. So that's the two things that we really need to have a look at, and where we will continue to focus our efforts.
Right. So we any questions? This is
just
sorry.
A quick follow-on clarification really about the median pay points and the comparisons into region. We do look to be an outlier with Buckinghamshire compared to others. Jane, we probably just need to seek to understand that really with our partners.
Yeah, and I have looked at those figures, and I do think we're an outlier. But again, I think that is because we have such a disproportionately high number of women in comparison to some of our other peer group. That's my first take on it, without actually having analysed that in depth.
Okay, Sally, and then Julian.
Well, my question is really the same as, or very similar to Alex's. Is that what I suppose I would ask is why the composition of our workforce is so different to Oxford or Bucks, you know, and therefore then results in this disparity. I would like to see some sort of comparison and what's resulting in us being an outlier.
Yeah, the best two comparators really are SABP and Oxford Health, really, because Bucks do have an acute, and we tend to see more men working in an acute setting, and women tending to dominate the community and mental health settings. We seem to be an attractive employer for women. We, as I say, Sally, I don't know the answer immediately. We don't seem to be attracting as many men into the organisation.
Okay, so it's a topic that we ought to note down, Jane, for follow-up. Julian, then Aileen.
Yeah, I just think it would be really helpful to get that sort of evidence-based statistical analysis, because it would be possible to improve your gender pay gap but make things worse for employees. So, you know, the good example is the number of people working part-time, you know, and people actually wanting to work part-time and having flexible working, but you don't want to impact on that. So, you know, getting a range of issues that you could attend to and then being really clear about the consequences of them, I think would be really helpful. So if we had that statistical analysis now, we could be really clear about what our appetite would be to address those things and which things actually you would accept might drive a disparity, but actually for the right reason. Yeah. And I think that's the bit that, you know, we need to get underneath. So, you know, if there is that further analysis that will give us total confidence that if we pull a lever, it will improve not only the gender pay gap, but actually won't harm other positives that are important in the working environment, I think is key.
Thank you, Julian. Aileen, then Naomi.
I wondered whether or not we have got more men. It's a bit of an odd question, I think, possibly. Why have we got more men that don't go for part-time working that would actually like to go for part-time working? I wondered if there's kind of something hidden underneath the data from that point of view, because in this day and age, there is no reason why men, you know, wouldn't go for part-time working. You know, nothing should stop them. So that was one question. Then I wanted to pick up on your comment about men traditionally work in the acute sector, and I just wondered if there was anything behind that as well.
Well, that's a good question, because we've actually looked even within our own organisation, and we have found that certain services and certain roles within certain types of services do attract more men than women. So again, there's something around that if we were to do a more of a deep dive into certain areas that, yeah, that seem to be more attractive to men for whatever reason. But yeah, and also agree about the part-time working. There's a lot of focus on part-time working, but for whatever reason, men aren't taking up part-time working opportunities as much as women. And that's something to do with perhaps cultural expectations, gender-based politics, you know, that may exist.
Yeah, interesting that, isn't it?
Okay, Naomi.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Jane. Jane, I'm in danger here of over kind of interpreting the stats that we see on page 72 of the pack, because I'm looking at the split of male to female in percentage terms and the overall population in each band. And I'm struck by what I would consider to be a bit of a step change in terms of percentages as you move into the band 8s. So we have, you know, a sort of quite what I would call as kind of flat percentage split as you move through from apprentices through to band 8 in terms of the kind of whatever it is, 85-15 split. But then it shifts to being more male dominated as you move into band 8 and beyond. And I just wonder if our approach to revealing the talent, the female talent, in what are quite large populations in bands 5, 6 and 7, sufficiently to ensure that we are uncovering that talent, you know, and promoting them into band 8 to address that. Do you see what I mean? I've probably made a complete hash of articulating that, but it does feel like we have got a robust population of women in bands 5, 6 and 7. Are we moving them through into 8 and above in as robust a fashion as we would like?
Yeah, I think that's a really good call, Naomi. I think band 8 is also a step change when we look at our diversity in other ways as well. So if we were to look at other protected characteristics, that sort of step between 7 and 8 is the one that we need to have a look at, and what happens at that progression point. I'll take that away as definitely something we need to have a look at as part of our, you know, our talent strategy, because that's the one that we're starting to become interested in.
Yeah, I mean, and just to step back, I mean, in an organisation which is female dominated, and maybe being female dominated is indeed the right answer. I don't know, but overall, if you're female dominated, then, you know, suggestively you should have a good population of females in the you know, lower ends of the organisation, sufficient to move them through into the upper ends of the organisation.
Yeah, quite interesting now. We're looking at that table. People actually to the 8A, it's actually spot on. So it's the 8B and beyond when it really starts. So actually the service, the sort of, you know, the band 7 is your sort of war manager, team leader. Your band 8A is your service manager. So up until service management, it reflects the kind of population. It's that next step up into senior middle management and everything else where there seems to be, it really does. I mean, I know the numbers are smaller, but that's the area. So we are getting people to the first service manager level, but beyond that, that's where people at 8A, what's happening to those 80% of women are at 8A and service manager level.
Right.
Yeah, and that's,
yeah, are those women or a subset of those women in 8A being developed sufficiently to move them through with a development path that goes into 8B and indeed beyond?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's some very good points, and I think there's the messages we've got to do more to help get more senior women into these posts. I also think that having the statistical help you talked about would be really valuable. It's up to you what you do, but I think that we would, as a board, like to have, you know, that understanding of where those real issues are. Some of these things that Julian mentioned, where, you know, we might change something and actually make it worse. So we need to really understand what we're doing. I'm sure we need to track through better the high level bands in 8Bs, etc. As to why we're not getting the right mix of people. And on a broader issue, particularly as we've just made a very clear anti-racist statement as a trust, the diversity, the pay gap in terms of diversity, for example, in ethnicity rather than just gender. And I don't know whether that's part of your plans, Jane, or whether it's in hand.
Yes, we do actually. We have done this year for the first time an ethnicity pay gap as well. So we can bring that back to the board on a separate occasion if you'd like to have a look at that as well.
But I think it would be at appropriate time be useful because it's an important initiative for us, this anti-racist stance. But also, if you don't look, you don't find. And I suspect we know from some of the stuff we've seen before that there are issues here, and it's not just about gender. So I think we need to make sure we really understand this. But so if I could just put a marker down, I think people are nodding. So we'd like to see this in the appropriate time.
Yeah, I can absolutely. I didn't want to bring both at the same
time.
No,
that's fine. That's fine. But we don't want to forget about it.
No, we can't. And so we've done that for the first time this year, and the plan next year would be that we will also do a disability pay gap.
That's fine. That's fine. Okay. Anything else on this? I'm not sure we solved any problems, but I think it all helps us understand the issue, and I think it's a genuine determination to do the right thing on this. Okay, 7.2 National NHS Staff Survey results.
Yes.
James, you again?
Yeah, it's me again, unless Alex wants to say anything before I start on the staff survey.
I shall just highlight a few things when you've completed, Jane. Thanks.
Okay. So staff survey results, another really strong set of results this year. And actually, what's I think really encouraging is that the response rate has also gone up. So our staff survey engagement score is 7.4. Frustratingly, we were 0.01 away from being rounded to 7.5. I'm sorry, Julian's heard me say this before. I find it very frustrating that we were that close. But actually what we need to take away is that we're getting a really stable set of results where we're hovering around that 7.4, 7.5 for a number of, we've done that for a number of years. And actually, we're continuing to get those rates even when more people are applying. So we've had a 65% response rate this year, and that's 5 percentage points higher than we've had previously, and about 50. The average, it's 15 is around 50% for community and mental health trusts in terms of response rates. We remain above average for all our themes, and for many of our questions we're above average, and we pulled out the ones that we're not. So a number of the things that we're looking to do is looking at how far away are we from the best and focusing on how do we get closer to being the best rather than areas that we really need to improve on. A couple of highlights, the top score, for example, having a compassionate culture, 7.7%. The top score for taking positive action on wellbeing and recommending this as a trust that people would want to work for. Some really positive trends as well. I'm sure Debbie is very pleased to see that we've got very positive trends on things like addressing unsafe clinical practice. So that has moved over the years from 67% to 73%. Yeah, so that we've got some really strong things to talk about that, and we can't take that away from from you as a board in terms of the leadership that you have shown, but also from the individuals on a day-to-day basis in terms of the way that they're leading and managing the organisation. Yes, we've got some areas we want to work on. We wouldn't be Berkshire Healthcare if we didn't want to look at the things that we want to work on. Burnout and excessive working hours are two big areas we want to focus on, and we actually have kicked off this year a piece of QI work to look at excessive working hours. We do know that that is a contributing factor to our turnover, so that piece of work is underway at the moment. And we still have a way to go on areas of discrimination and also violence against our staff. As you know, that's a real area of focus, the discrimination piece under the anti-racism work that we're doing. And we continue to look at how we can reduce violence in the workplace, and both staff on staff and patient on staff violence. We also see some trends in terms of increasing dissatisfaction with pay, not surprisingly, given where we are today, Minu, with the doctors' strikes. And we've had, obviously increasing strike action across the NHS. And I think that's putting pressure on some things like people looking at wanting to move to another role. but also we've got to focus on the fact that we've had a slightly lower response rate on the appraisals, people saying they've not had an appraisal this year. We have launched a new appraisal form, which might help us to make things a bit easier. We might have a bit of dissatisfaction with the new appraisal form and being introduced and people having to get used to it. But we continue to keep appraisals in our line of sight and try to make those as simple and as easy for people to do as possible. And we continue to, encourage everyone to have an appraisal and expect our line managers to give everybody an appraisal. The workforce race equality data, we are now scoring better than average, but the gap is still there. As I say, we will focus on that as part of the anti-racism work. And we do see some big divisional differences, and we want to explore why we're getting divisional differences as well. The same with the WDES, so that's the Workforce Disability Equality Survey. Again, scoring better, but the gap remains. And again, divisional differences. As you know, one of the big areas we're wanting to focus on and where we think some of the discrepancy comes up sometimes is in neurodiversity. And there's an increasing, focus since we've developed our neurodiversity strategy to see if we can address issues that arise with our neurodivergent staff. And sexual orientation, some our staff who declare as LGBTQ plus also declare that they have a slightly worse experience in the workplace, although we don't have a specific survey response in the same way as we have the RES and the WDES. And the divisional movement is an interesting one. This because we had some new set of questions last year. We couldn't do this last year, but we have now got a comparator where our divisional scores are this year compared to last year. And there have been some shifts. So corporate services, for example, has seen significantly worse movement, so downwards. And People Directorate, I will pull out specifically. People Directorate last year had an above average, a score which was above the trust average, now significantly below average. We've got some work to taking place. We're doing to try and rapidly understand, what was causing that and what we can do about it. But I think undoubtedly some of the pressures that have been on the workforce pressures have seeped through to the way people are feeling in certainly my directorate. And as I say, there are some of the directorates where we are beginning to see a movement more towards the left, so deteriorating scores. So again, working with those divisions, working with those areas with the business partners to understand why that might be and what we can do to address that. I shall pause there for questions.
Jane, thank you. We'll just take questions. I do like that chart on page 102, sort of Boston matrix. And I do note, of course, the bottom left-hand one is PPH, which is a concern. Okay, Mark, is it Mark and then Sally? Sorry, I'm not. Go ahead, Mark.
Thank you, Jane, for the presentation, and congratulations to all of the executive in terms of sustaining that performance, despite all of the pressures being brought on us as a trust. One of the things that really stands out for me, when you put these results against what the media is promoting on a daily basis in terms of the turbulence across the NHS, is a really positive story. And what I'd really like to know, Jane, is how you're going to use that in terms of your social media and other communications to almost counteract the public perception of us as a great place to come to work, and how you can use that in terms of our recruitment for staff.
Yeah. We do mention it quite heavily on social media, and we try to now incorporate that into our job adverts as well when we're attracting people to the organisation, making it very clear that this is, a CQC outstanding trust, and that we do have, such high engagement scores. It is a difficult one because actually, although we might have the highest engagement score, we're one PIP away from places like SABP. Across the southeast region as a whole, and we do see that we have a relatively high level of engagement scores. Royal Berks, I think, are one of the highest in the southeast. I think they're about the third acute trust in the country. So it's difficult to say that we are a lot better than our peers. We're at a similar level, maybe one PIP ahead. than our peers. And we've discussed this on a regional event where we think that because these staffing issues are so high in the Southeast, we have to put such an effort into giving people a great place to work, that we do see on average higher engagement scores in this region.
Thank you. Rajiv.
Thanks, Martin. So, hi, Jane. So I agree with Martin that the slide on page 102, I think, is very interesting, and it potentially tells us that looking at averages sometimes can be dangerous, and we should perhaps look at the underlying results of each of our areas or each of our services. I had a simple question on that slide 102, which is what is the scale? So when it's minus 40 plus 40, is that percent? What is?
Yes, so it's has there been a movement, so a sort of percentage movement downwards? I'm sorry, I haven't got the scale, but I can get that for you.
So if I'm reading it correctly, so if I take PPH, which Martin referenced, it's in the minus 30. So that's 30%. The score there, their scores this year were 30% below our average as a trust.
No, no, that's not right. No, it's done on the questions. It's not a percentage. The percentages are quite small, so it's done against each of the questions. The movement, so the number movement on each questions rather than percentage. But Jane can explain that, but it's nothing as dramatic as that type of shift.
No, it's not.
It's helpful, Jane, if you can clarify it.
Yeah, it's not 30%. It's saying that how many of those questions actually saw a downward trend. So how many were worse than previous years, and that we've got two different ways of showing the same information. But that particular chart looks at how many questions were worse than they were last year, but we also do have that in terms of the overall engagement scores as well, and the shift which we haven't included in the pack, but I can send that.
Right, so the x-axis is how many scores were worse than last year, and the y is how many scores were worse than the average trust score, but it doesn't give you a sense of how much worse they were. They could be like 0.1% worse.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do have that separately on another slide, which I can circulate afterwards.
Would be interesting to see that, because I think that would be more meaningful.
Yeah, I can absolutely send that. Yeah.
And just before we move on, it'd be interesting to see the WRES and WDES equivalents of this, because I suspect those vary quite a bit by division.
Yes, and I think we. Yes, absolutely, Martin. I think that might be going to DSG, but I will certainly take that away.
Okay, that's fine. I know you're working on it. Sally.
Great to see the score, Jane, around engagement and staff feeling confident that they can, that concerns would be addressed. It seemed to me, and I'm sure you're doing this, but that actually it's important to get the sort of data at divisional level out there, and then very clear action plans, because once you delve into this data, there's large differences within different divisions, and also to some extent, triangulating it with other data. If you look at Prospect Park and Community Health West, you then triangulate that with retention rates and incident rates, but it is really, the data is really most powerful, I think, at that divisional level, and then clear action plans in relation to those local issues.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Sally, and that is underway at the moment. That's already started with our HR business partners and developing the tailored action plans for different areas. Again, we have to be aware that although we say that, for example, Prospect Park has more negative scores, they are still better than a lot of other trusts. And we're now in a silly situation. I've seen it in my own team, where we are red ragged for a score of something like 78 points, 78 or 78%, when because the trust average is 83%.
Yes, yeah, I'm aware of that. Benchmarking with other organisations, but obviously benchmarking at, how we're progressing internally as well is as important. And we know that there are issues at Prospect Park, and it's how they sort of all triangulate.
Yeah, and it's more about trying to pick up early signals that areas might be moving away, from good scores, or we're seeing more movement away, and that's what we're trying to make sure that we're picking up those early signals and not, as you say, hiding them in the bigger picture.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, Tamina.
Thank you. Picking up on Debbie's point in the chat, I suppose reflection on PPH, it's our area of kind of highest risk and pressure, and I think we mustn't underestimate what it might feel like to be a member of staff working in that environment. I suppose the other thing Trees is really clear on, and it's not all of the wards. There are specific wards, for example, where we are seeing much more negative scores, and there will be a number of reasons for that. So I know the team are on sort of trying to get under the skin of that. The other thing that was interesting is sort of through the divisional restructure was observations from teams that staff had different experiences depending on which team they worked, whether they worked in the East or the West, in terms of how, for example, maybe policies were being understood or enacted. So I really hope that restructuring that sort of consistency of approach will unearth some of these issues as well. And I suppose we have to remind ourselves that the next survey isn't that far away. So now is the sort of sweet spot really in terms of us really recognising and taking some action.
Tamina, thank you. I totally agree about Prospect Park, the points you made. And also, I do look forward to the unification of the divisions. I think should help. Right, where are we, Alex?
Yeah, so it's a hugely important data set and temperature check, isn't it, for the organisation? And the triangulation point from Sally's really key. If you look across at burnout versus health and wellbeing views and perspectives of support, there is a bit of a question in the context that we mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, is how long can we hold this position? And actually some assurance around our corporate strategic work and transformation, as well as the divisional action plans, are directly focused to addressing some of that burnout and stress and anxiety actually that's still persistent in our sickness absence. So working on transformation, demand and capacity for key risk services in our quality concerns. This all supports that triangulation, our focus for the strategy, alongside the workforce piece that Jane's doing. So very valuable also just to assure us around the strategy going forward.
Thank you, Alex. Aileen.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Jane. I mean, we're doing really, really well comparatively. Just a couple of little observations. That chart that we've spoken quite a bit about, the movement chart, has there been any response to the teams to seeing that? Because I think that's the first time we've presented it like that, isn't it?
It's the first time we've presented it like that in the last couple of since year before last. So we have had it the year before last when we had a consistent set of data to compare against. Last year, new questions, so we weren't able to show that chart. So that's why we've reintroduced it again this year, now that we've got a consistent set of questions. And absolutely, that is now being shared. So each division knows where they sit relative to others. They've seen that high level data, and then we're going into the detail with each of the divisions about where they, what that means for them.
And is that presumably will lead to a sharing of best practice between divisions? Yeah. Okay, cool. I mean, that will be a really important outcome of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It is a little bit of a strange data set now, because as you know, with Tamina's restructure, we have got slightly different operational model. But actually, I think, to Tamina's point, the operational model will help us to raise up to the best practice, because we've got some more consistency between East and West, for example.
Yeah, absolutely, and I can absolutely see that being a help. And then the final point, which it kind of will sound slightly negative, but I feel I have made it previous years, is although we've got overall good engagement, there are still some really, really, really disappointing numbers, like the number of people in the res figures. I've just got that screen up in front of me. Still 59.8 people saying that they're experiencing bullying. You know, just it's just shocking, isn't it? So we, you know, we absolutely need to get underneath some of these numbers and really focus on some of them. And I know that's exactly what we're doing, but I don't think we could have this discussion without specifically raising that point.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think the good thing in this organisation is that we probably know where those areas are. So I don't think it's hidden. There may be one or two that we just don't know about, but actually I think, particularly with the work that Debbie does through the Safety Culture Group, we do look very closely at areas that we know are experiencing violence, where there's more bullying being reported, and we have got a got action plans in place to support those areas and those individuals as well. So yeah, I'm not saying we catch everything, but we I think we feel that we get quite a high level of reporting of things that are happening. Having said that, there's still a discrepancy. I did look at our actual reports of violence against staff, and there were more people saying that they had experienced violence in the staff survey than the numbers who'd actually reported in the last 12 months. But you know, a small variation, but majority of them, you know, we're seeing being reported.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jane, thank you very much. Clearly this is really important stuff for us as a board, and there's good news here, which is great, but there's also, and as Summer said, we wouldn't be this trust if we didn't look at the things that needed improving. And I suspect some of these is we got data here we need to learn from, but we basically want to get the right culture in the organisation such that it sort of solves itself, if you know what I mean, the way we all want to behave, the way we want others to behave towards us. And I think it's going to be a determined effort required to sort of steadily move this in the right direction. But thank you, Jane, to you and your colleagues and staff and the trust. But good results. But we got, you know, could a bit like my school reports, could do better. You know, except my school report didn't say good in the first place. It said, you know, just could do better.
I think I do have to say, I think there's a thank you to the board as well, because that culture comes from the top as well. Okay. You know, so we don't get those grades and those sort of scores if you don't have a board that also encourages that culture and a group of execs who actually demonstrate that culture. So, you know, please do take some of that feedback for yourselves as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's a topic we're very committed to, so we look forward to engaging again in the future.
All right, take care, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Jane,
Bye-bye.
for that. Okay. Finance report, item 8, Paul.
Thanks, Martin. So obviously we're at the back end of financial year in terms of the report. There's not a huge amount of significant movements to report this month. So we finished February with 500k surplus. That moves the organisation to £1 million surplus at the end of February, which is 2 million better than planned. Revenue expenditure continues in line with our forecast predictions for the end of the year. We've released 1.9 of the 2 million additional ERF money that we expect to be clawed back. That'll be fully released by the end of the year. Workforce, we saw small increases in contracted numbers, which were broadly in line with investments that we've received during the year, particularly in children's services. Short reporting month, so temporary bank and agency costs reduced slightly. Expect to see those costs increase in March, as they usually do, in line with additional annual leave been taken in the month. Worth just having a look at page 112, which is the out of area placement chart, which you can see we were running at around 30 placements in October. That's dropped back in February to an average of 14 placements. Again, might be a small bounce back in March because we've seen some high levels of acuity and bed pressures at PPH, so expecting a small increase before the end of the financial year. Cash, still strong position, 58.5 million. We closed I'll come to it. We closed 22-23 with 54 million, so it did reduce in line with some additional expenditure on the capital programme before the end of the financial year. And on capital, you see at the end of February, we're reporting 2.6 million behind our system CDEL target, with London Road completing in February and our annual IT kit replacement spend going through the other main capital programmes that were due to complete. Adlam Villas and Fairacres, majority of those costs have come through March. So as at the end of March, giving you a precursor to the year-end report, will be in line with our system expenditure target for capital, which I think, given everything that's been going on in terms of managing supply chains and increases that we've seen in inflation and having to make movements on the capital programme during the year, is a really good effort by both the estates and the IT team. So happy to take any questions, Martin.
Can I start off? Look at page 107. It's about the cost improvement programmes. 4.3 million less than plan year to date, with 2.5 million unidentified schemes, and yet you're forecasting coming in on plan, as it were. Can you just say anything about the risk involved in those unidentified cost improvement programmes?
So I think we probably acknowledge that, given where we were putting the plan together this year with the level of staffing that we assumed we were going to get, we required effectively a cost improvement programme that was overstated in terms of what we needed to deliver. So that unidentified element was linked to not achieving ERF targets, which we obviously, there was no clawback of ERF funding, so that additional 2 million is effectively covered off that unidentified element of the plan.
Thanks for that. Any questions for Paul? No? There we are, Paul. You've answered all their questions before they asked them. Okay, can we go on to performance report 8.1, please?
Yeah, certainly. So again, if we just highlight some of the key driver metrics. So starting with falls, obviously below target at 19 this month. We've now got the new falls technology rolled out across all of our community wards, and we're just completing the training for staff on that. Latest benchmark report still indicates that we're 30% below peers in terms of our fall rates per 1,000 bed numbers. So we've set a high target, and we're still comparing really well nationally. Going into next financial year, this one's probably going to be will be retired as a driver metric, given the success we've had and where we're heading with that. Self-harm, obviously, want to note huge increase in instances reported in February, predominantly relating to 2 patients on Bluebell ward who account for 95 of the 145 instances in month. So really difficult for the team managing those 2 patients. Physical health checks, we don't often mention. It's been fairly static for the majority of the year at around 80%. Team have done some really good targeted work in Slough area, which is the area where they've got least engagement over time. 50% increase in appointments or checks over the past month, which has helped increase that to 84% overall and pushing on the 85% target that the organisation's set itself. Mentioned in the finance section around level of OPES, you'll see the OPES target's been green for the past 2 months. Risk that it will slightly tip into red by the end of the quarter, but that green reporting for 2 months in line with the usage that we've seen. Page 113, just worth mentioning again, mental health and community health occupancy levels are remaining high, but positive that we've seen a reduction in delayed transfers in mental health for 2 months now. And finally, just on page 134, just mentioning the audiology waits, less than 6 months, where we're still not hitting the required target. We know that the staffing position is improving within that team, and they expect to return to compliant targets by towards the end of Q1 next financial year. But happy to leave it there and take any questions.
Any questions for Paul? Sally?
Paul, when I look at these, am I right in thinking we're getting more incidents of prone restraints, which is slightly concerning, isn't it?
So just tracking the page that you're on, Sally.
I'm just trying to find it when I've got my notes here. I think it's sorry.
131.
Top line.
131. Yes, we are seeing slightly more instances coming through. I might need to leave it to some of my clinical colleagues to try and have. Thanks, Debbie.
That's okay. So the 6th in December was what. So this scorecard is what is initially reported. It's not necessarily when we have done work to look at the individual instances. So that 6th in December was reported. Actually, I think it was 2 or 3. And the 13th in February, we'll be needing to do the same with. I do know in February there was an element of a patient that required a few restraints, and his choice was for prone. So that it needs to be looked into, Sally, before we can definitely say there's an increase overall in prone restraint. I don't think that is actually being shown here.
Right, it'd be interesting to see what you, because obviously they need to be avoided, don't they? Prone restraints, they can be dangerous. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions, comments? Thanks so much then, Paul and others. Green Plan. Oh no, sorry, Finance Investment Performance Committee. Naomi, were you going to say anything?
I can be a very, very brief, Martin, because the board has covered off on so much of this. I think just, well, first of all, we met in person in London House for the first time in over 3 years. So that was actually really cool. I think a shout out to Paul and his team on 2 counts. One is, bringing in the plan. We are at the end of the financial year, and kudos to him and his team for bringing it in across the metrics: income and expenditure, capex, cost improvement, balance sheet is extremely robust, and so on. We've looked at the performance scorecards, so I won't dwell on that. And the only other piece, again, shout out to Paul and his team, which the board will cover off on in our next session, which is crystallising the plan for this financial year. I don't know, Paul, if it's been submitted yet, maybe not. But Paul and his team have done a super job of doing a kind of bottom-up approach to developing the plan for this financial year. So, and that's of course important from the perspective of assurance to the board in in building the plan in such a way that it has granularity and it's owned in the depths of the organisation. So with that, that's all I have to say. Actually, thanks, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. Right, shall we go on to the Green Plan then?
It's fine, Martin, if I just if I share my screen and just take you through the presentation.
We have got the slides, I think, in the pack, have we, Paul?
You have, which if everyone's comfortable just going through that, it might be easier just to, might be easier. Hold on. Sorry, just my Teams has changed. And apologies in advance, right on cue, I've got some workmen come to fix my boiler, so I'll apologise if there's any banging or in the background. Right. Can I just ask, has that come up?
That's fine.
Okay, so obviously it's just a annual update, first one that we've had to do on the Green Plan. So I thought I'd just start by reminding the board of some of the kind of the national commitments that the NHS has made, and kind of been the fundamental reason for our response in terms of development of our own organisations and green plan. So obviously the government has committed to net zero by 2050. The NHS is obviously a key contributor to that, set itself some ambitious targets in terms of reducing direct emissions by 2040 and indirect emissions by 2045. So ahead of the the national government targets. So a lot of guidance coming out, obviously a lot of it linking through to the delivering net zero National Health Service policy that came through. And again, it's the key ones for us are the directly controlled emissions, whereas the ambition to reduce it 80% by between 2028 and 2032, which is the first target that's going to come through and hit us. And then emissions that we can influence. So what the guidance calls our carbon footprint plus ambition for an 80% reduction, effectively 2036 to 2039. So again, just some infographics just to remind the board of kind of national, again, those national commitments, but also just where community and mental health trusts sit. So you'll see in the chart here, so these are the ones that effectively are the ones that they're really targeting first, which are those direct emissions. So those
You've frozen, I think.
Right. I might. Have you got me back?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you still see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just go back. So there's the direct emissions here, which are the ones that are obviously the first ones that are to be targeted. And then as we move through time, obviously the guidance is trying to aim to really target in on these indirect emissions around utility usage, business travel waste, etc. As you'll see from this graphic, in terms of overall NHS carbon emissions, community and mental health providers are not the key drivers in terms of the emission levels. Obviously, a lot more produced by the acutes, which is what you would expect. And then this graphic again, just kind of breaking down the carbon emissions by area. So again, these are the ones that are affected predominantly in terms of the buildings, our fleet, and a lot, which is this indirect, which is linked to the supply chain, which is obviously ones that we've got much more difficult challenge in terms of trying to control at this stage. So we brought green plan to the board around this time last year, covering commitments over the next 3 years, 38 direct actions in there, with some ambitious targets around staff engagement and training, targets around reducing business and travel, which is obviously quite a challenging one to do. Built-in decarbonisation linked to utilities and reduction in our CO2 emissions, and 50% reduction by 25-26, and ambition to reduce the amount of waste generated across the organisation, initially by 10% in 23-24, and then thinking about further targets as we move through the next few years. Worth just mentioning as well, obviously this has been first year for the green plan. A lot of work done in terms of building some of the infrastructure and reporting and support groups that are needed around the delivery of the green plan. So we've got working groups set up with our PFI providers and NHSPS as our key estates partners. And obviously estates have got their own working groups set up to look at kind of building assurances as well as waste management, and significant traction coming from the wider NHS as well. So more groups that we've been invited to work with at kind of a local level across the ICS, but also regional levels in terms of procurement groups and medicine management groups. So the plan bit was split into kind of clear sections in terms of where we wanted to make some improvements in our achievements over the sort of first 3 years. So all these slides just highlight what we said we were going to do and whether we've actually done them or not. So in terms of our people commitment, obviously 2 key elements that we wanted to do. One was around engagement with the organisation, which we've done through Team Brief and Nexus. I think it's clear, and we've had a recent report that kind of testifies to this. There's more that we can do, and there's more that we can do on the engagement side, use of social media, and bringing forward some kind of real examples of what we've done to kind of foster new ideas and bring some more ideas forward. We're also engaging through Trust Induction, and Tony, our current sustainability manager, delivers a session on that for all new staff. So great that we're getting to new staff on kind of day one, as it were, but we need to address those comms to the existing organisation. Travel, all of our lease vehicles are now EV, which is really positive, including the new Health Bus that we purchased about a year ago, and we're continuing to expand the use of EV charging points across all main sites now. I think the only one is Kev 2, which we've got plans to put chargers in, but they're not in yet. But again, we're continuing to push this, so all new buildings will have charging points. London House will have them imminently once we've taken delivery of those. Our commitments to waste and utilities, all energy contracts now are come from renewables, and that includes the energy contracts with our supply partners on PFI and NHSPS. We've continued to see reductions in gas and electricity usage, which is really, really positive. I'll come on to just a bit later. 2 points highlighted here in terms of kind of our access to current data. So we need to make some improvements in terms of our regular management of utility information, and we had an ambition to cut confidential waste usage, which we just don't have the data on at the moment. So again, the data and the reporting are 2 areas that we probably need to make some improvements on. We've stopped single-use plastics, focusing, not obviously entirely, but focusing primarily on kind of catering and disposable items. That's being done, and we have seen an increase in the volume of waste recycling, which is positive. Again, procurement, there's that indirect element of the targets, so a lot of work with procurement. So our tender process now includes a specific section on addressing suppliers' sustainability credentials, and our sustainability manager feeds into the assessment of that. So we are increasingly looking at sustainability as one of our criteria within our tendering processes. Again, mentioned single-use plastics. We're now using 100% recycled paper, and we've developed and are working with partners on procurement policies that kind of strengthen our ambitions in terms of how we want to approach procurement in a more sustainable way moving forward, which is kind of product substitution and commitments to work with suppliers on their green credentials going forward. Estates, lots obviously that we can do around our estate, and we're obviously starting to see that. Obviously London House is a prime example of that, so starting to incorporate where we can building management systems. LED lighting is now in place across most of our estate. We're ensuring we're using modern building techniques in terms of insulation, etc., to try and reduce sustainability impact, and all business cases now have a clear sustainability section built in, so that we're addressing it or trying to understand the sustainability impact of business cases even at a very early stage. Again, we're expanding that now to looking at sustainability assessments when we're looking at new lease properties as well, in terms of the energy utilisation of the buildings and green credentials of the landlords. And again, looking to do more. We've done some, but again, could do more in terms of information and guidance to teams and staff around efficient use of energy. So these are just some of these we're just getting the numbers through, which will obviously feed into the annual report coming through. But some encouraging numbers, some that again we need to understand a little bit more going forward. So water consumption's increased quite significantly. We're looking at that by site just so we can understand what's driving that. Business mileage has increased, but again, if we look at the vehicle miles chart, obviously significantly impacted by COVID, and to some degree, as staff move back to offices and are doing more face-to-face appointments, not necessarily surprising that we're seeing an increase in vehicle mileage. And our total waste again could be linked to staff coming back to sites has increased slightly. On the positive side, our gas consumption reduced significantly over the past year, as did electricity consumption, and we're seeing as a percentage more of our waste being recycled. So in terms of the acid test in terms of CO2 emissions, as you'll see there, we're continuing to see the trend over the past 4 years, which is year-on-year reduction in the Trust's CO2 emissions. So 56% reduction over the past 5 years and a 29% reduction this year. The interesting one is probably the chart on the top right, which shows how that CO2 emissions are made up at the moment. And you see very clearly that for us now, travel and gas consumption are the two key drivers behind those CO2 numbers. So possibly two areas where we do need to think about if we're going to make some real inroads into those remaining CO2 emissions, two areas where potentially we need to focus. Plans for the coming year. We've got the first one there in terms of people's recruitment of a sustainability lead. So we've had an interim for the past year. These roles are proving really, really difficult to recruit. We think we've got a new sustainability lead who's come through and just undergoing final checks and will be in place within the next month or two, which I think is really encouraging for in terms of delivery of the plans going forward. We've want to establish a green network, and we've got some support from the University of Reading in terms of a graduate to help pull that network of green champions together. It's a model that's been used in other providers to a degree of success, so something that we want to actively encourage and try. And as I've alluded to a couple of times, we probably need to do a little bit more in terms of our communication, in terms of use of social media, and really selling some of the good work that the team have done over the past year. Travel, we need to develop a green travel plan and provide clear, big sort of signpostage to alternatives to driving in terms of use of public travel for staff and patients. And we'll continue to roll out EV charging as far as the infrastructure allows us to, and it's sensible to. On the estate side, you may be aware that we put in a bid for decarbonisation at West Berks Hospital. We were unsuccessful in that bid, but we have got potential options to look at doing that ourselves, given our relatively strong cash position. Obviously, the other things that we could look at doing as well is something around solar and PV arrays at some of our sites as well. We're currently working with our new head of estates to look at those options in terms of level of investment and return on investment of those options. And again, we've got a tiny forest which we've got at West Berks. We've got the options to do that potentially at some of our other sites which we're looking at, and a focus on food waste in particular, which, although not high volume, is something that the team feel and want to look at across the sites. And then procurement, need to look if there's any other areas of single-use plastics where we've got feasibility of doing some product substitutions, and the team working hard in terms of preparing for the April requirements for our key suppliers to have carbon reduction plans. Other things we just need to make the board aware of, obviously, is it still feels like an emerging area in the sense we're getting significant local and national guidance feeding through, which we just need to consider and see if it changes on any of our plans. So we recently got the NHS zero building standards come through. So we've got to go through those and see if there's anything in there that we need to address that would impact on our plans going forward. And in the context of strategy refresh, we've committed to agreeing a specific breakthrough objective around sustainability, which could be something along the lines of linking to targeted waste reduction or recycling levels over the next year. We'll work on that with the new sustainability lead when they come in. So that was a quick whistle stop of where we've been over the past year. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Well, Tamina.
Thank you for, it sounds like a huge amount of work has been done, and I'm aware we haven't actually got a kind of a dedicated lead in place yet, so it's really impressive. I suppose one of the things we just need to get the balance right is, for example, things like travel, how we balance travel from a sustainability perspective and staff efficiency in terms of them being able to get out and about. So that will be, I think, a bit of a challenge for us. The other thing is how we can start to work with teams to develop some local opportunities and local champions. I'm sure there's many things locally that people would want to be leading on as well. So I think there's kind of that bigger strategic piece we do as an organisation, and then really kind of seeding the opportunities to do things much more locally.
Yeah, agree. I mean, I think the network green champions, I think, could be a really important thing. I mean, at the moment it feels like, and like I say, I've alluded to it, the internal audit plan, there's lots of communications internally amongst those involved in the green agenda, but it feels like we're missing an opportunity with staff on a wider basis to engage.
Paul, how much is our the things we can do impacted because many of our buildings are owned by NHS Property Services? How is that?
So I've not got the figures per building, but I think the general premise is it is impacted. So if you look at some areas of our estate that aren't owned by us, they're not as efficient as they could be. Equally, it's difficult for us to kind of retrofit some efficiencies in there. So, you know, for example, it'd be difficult putting building management systems into some elements of that estate to increase the efficiency of them. So I think PS specifically, they're committed to the same green agenda that we are. They're doing what they can in terms of LED lighting and EV charging across their sites, etc. But fundamentally, they're dealing with some old and inefficient estate, which obviously forms part of what we want to do with the estate strategy in terms of either moving into other facilities that, you know, we can lease, which are of a better quality, or longer term plans for PS around coming out of some of their existing estate.
Okay, thank you. Naomi.
Thank you, Martin, and you kindly asked my big question.
Oh, sorry.
Probably one of the hardest nuts to crack, actually, Paul, because of the setup, the structure of it, and how it's governed. But actually, that brings me on to another one of my main questions, which is around governance. And Tamina, I think you said that we don't yet have a single point of accountability. We don't have a green director or equivalent in place. But what's the plan? What's the vision for the governance of our green agenda? How do you see that emerging?
So obviously I've got exec responsibility for sustainability. We'll put the sustainability, or let's say once we've got the permanent sustainability lead, they can, like say, they'll lead the green group in terms of delivering the objectives that are already set down in the plan. And those will feed up into our business and strategy exec. So you'll see sight of it through FIT.
So we're in the market to recruit for that position right now?
Yeah, we've got someone who we're in the process of recruiting.
And it's the idea that we'll wait for that person to come in to develop the broader governance structure. You know, he or she is going to come in and say, well, this is how we're going to organise it. This is how we're going to drive projects. This is how we're going to make sure that the KPIs are as we want them, and that they're, we're going to perform against those, etc., all that good stuff.
I think given their responsibility, they certainly need to have a hand in that. And like I said, that they should be here. within the next, I would have thought, 6 to 8 weeks. So we've got the time, I think, to build on what we've currently got. I mean, we've already got, like I say, an established green group that reports into business and finance, so we're not starting it from scratch. I think some of the things we need to do probably are more around those specific targets, and the risk is we could do 101 projects if you try and interpret and pull through all of the national guidance, which are the ones that me and the group think are the ones that are going to have the most impact on the things. So that's definitely a key piece of work that they're going to have to pick up when they start.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think if we may, Martin, when that individual is ready, willing and able to kind of frame how they see this going forward, it'd be nice to bring that to the board.
It would, and also to bring some understanding of, as Paul said, where the things are that are really going to make a difference, as opposed to the myriad of things that you might spend your time on but may not make very much difference. Alex.
The green agenda is identified in the trust strategy, so I will be asking Paul to put into the strategic implementation plan the relevant milestones over the next 3 years. I know we're under development with new people, but it's another place for visibility for the board.
Thanks so much, Alex. And I seem to recall the plan went down very well with staff when we originally put it out, so I think they'll be holding us to account. Julian.
Yeah, you keep stealing everybody's points, don't you, Martin, today? I was going to make exactly that point, that induction is, so yeah, when we do induction, it's a very common question about what it is as credentials, and we know that in terms of the employment market, not talking about this, but having a track record of doing some things is really important in terms of people's choices. So it's ever increasing, and I agree with yourself, Martin, and Alex, is choosing the areas that are going to have an impact and where we can have an impact. If we can't persuade NHSP to do something today, there is some things that we can do in some of the buildings that we own, so we should just sort of get on with that. And then I think it's really important that the person and people overseeing our priorities are cognizant of that wider strategy. So our last discursive board meeting, we talked about actually a vision whereby we'll be going and travelling around clinically more often, because we'll be doing virtual wards, community response times and everything else. Now, in the long term, you could see that being done in electric vehicles, but at the moment, for the majority of our staff on band 5 to 7, the cost of electric vehicles are completely prohibitive. And also, if you're reliant to a large extent on public charging because you live in a flat or whatever, it's very difficult, really. So I think the other trick here will be setting out perhaps a longer term vision and accepting you might have some clinical travel that sort of goes up, but in the long term, you're able to remedy that without us sort of getting too worried about just looking at the bold metrics. Otherwise, you could end up stymieing your own strategy, which would be mad.
Yeah. I agree with that. And also, we've got to remember that we do want to encourage the digital delivery as well, as that gets more sophisticated, so we don't have to travel. But I accept your point. And interestingly, on the green travel plan, some of these things on some page 148, Paul, some of these things will need sort of, maybe the ICSs could come together, because if you live in North Hampshire, where I live, there's no bus that connects you to Berkshire. So if you want to go north of the M3, you have to drive, regardless. Now, I'm not saying we should suddenly change that, but some of these things we can't influence ourselves, but with the broader partners, we might be able to influence. But anyway, there we are. And I agree absolutely with Julian's point about the cost of electric cars. Even for poor chairs, they're very expensive. Right, let's just move on. I think I just got something on governors now, if I just get my agenda up. Yes, the Council of Governors update. The only thing I was going to just report, I think I may have mentioned before, was the Appointments and Remuneration Committee of the Council of Governors met to look at the potential candidates for Mahmouda's replacement when Mahmouda retires. I'm pleased to say we had a very good list of candidates, very strong, very diverse, and although we haven't seen them or anything like that yet, on paper they look a good selection. So I'm optimistic that we'll have a good selection of candidates for the governors to choose from. So that's, I think, rather positive. Any other business? No. Next public meeting is the 9th of May, and now we'll consider